Hello, I'm Joshua and I'm an INTP. Um, I want to start a new series of videos, and in this series of videos, I'll be proposing some thoughts I have on creativity. I have surprisingly done quite a bit of research on creativity, and so I would just like to share my thoughts and what that research has led me to believe. Um, where I would like to start is just a very somewhat interesting term that you hear used, thrown around for highly creative individuals, and that they are childlike. That people who are geniuses or people who are extremely creative have this childlike nature to them that gives them this superb perspective and sort of ability to generate new ideas and to be stricken with awe and inspired by the environment. And there are certainly, I feel, biological and neuroscientific reasons for why a highly creative individual may display childlike characteristics. And so I will call this first video on the On Creativity series on being childlike. And so I'd like to unpack what it means in a practical way, to be childlike is, and then explore the neuroscience, excuse me, to some extent to what being childlike is. And I would first like to start at the neuroscientific level, or at least neuropathological level, and talk about a phenomena known as low latent inhibition. And what low latent inhibition seems to be is that people can't not stop paying attention to what other people would consider meaningless information in the environment. It seems that their precuneus or their default mode network is always on, and they have this sort of underlying subconscious buzzing going on in their mind. I deal with low latent inhibition, and the best way I can describe it is that things that don't seem to have any particular importance to other people have so much importance to you. The individual, they'll notice things, and things that when you grow up or you're socialized or when you've had an experience sits there and turns off that phenomena. So somebody with low latent inhibition, when they look at a blot on the wall, or at least I know when I look at a blot on the wall, the block could mean something. It could be interesting. And to where another person is just going to say, well, that's a blot on the wall. Why does it matter? Or just the stimuli in an environment that most people would ignore, or their brain fuzzes out. So your environment, it's a rich information network, and if you took in every stimulant, you'd be overwhelmed with information. And so um, the part of the brain that deals with filtering out information just doesn't seem to be as active in somebody with low latent inhibition as in a normal person. And what's so interesting is when you have somebody with low levels of intelligence and they deal with low latent inhibition, they're hospitalized. They're in a loony bin because you can imagine that if you're constantly paying attention to information that seems virtually meaningless in an environment and ascribing a great deal of meaning to it, it'll drive you insane. The clicking that the door makes when it's open, the constant buzzing of white noise when it's silent. It's funny that the things that stand out when you have low latent inhibition, and it's why I think that highly creative individuals, they probably have some degree of low latent inhibition because they look at the world in a way that they imbue meaning to things and take a second glance at things that we would take for granted. And I think that has something to say on what it means to be childlike. Now, in a practical aspect, I know like not everybody has low latent inhibition, so what does it mean, therefore, to be childlike beyond just the pathological or neuroscientific perspective. And I thought about this for quite a bit because I have low latent inhibition. So everything somebody says about creativity or writes in a paper, I think, oh, that's interesting, that's interesting, that's interesting. Well, there's this small thing that nobody else seems to just pick up because it's kind of casually mentioned. Oh, and Einstein, he had a childlike disposition to him. Or they'll you writers from Howard Gardner to so many writers, you just find that in them, that they had this awe and wonder. I was reading a book, Creating Minds, and it said the same thing, and I was just thought, well, what the hell is that? Like, what does that mean? And well, most people just look at it and they're like, well, who cares? Like, they're childlike. Don't you get the metaphor? And to me, it's not just simply a metaphor. Well, obviously, it's a metaphor, but it's not simply a metaphor. It has to do with two factors. So, what do you notice about children? Children, they say, kids say the darndest things now, don't they? So why do kids say the darndest things? Because kids aren't socialized. And I think when it comes to creativity and its expression in an individual, it has to deal with sort of this rebellious nature. And I don't mean that in any superficial way, like a rebel without a cause sort of deal, but it's just that people that seem to be highly creative, they're not satisfied with things, and they're not taught to, or they just haven't accepted being inundated with the idea that life is what it is, and you should accept it for what it is, which it seems that most people do to some extent, and they do that through being socialized in the home environment and through their school, that you're handed this thing, and that's what it is, and you have to deal with it. I'm a highly creative mathematician and physicist, at least a budding mathematician and physicist. I'm still undergoing my schooling, but I notice I'm not, just because you present something to me, if it lacks in its presentation, or at least I perceive a lacking therefore of that idea, I want to do something with it, and I want to work on it, and I want to complete it. I think that people that are creative, they're not satisfied with, I don't want to say merely the status quo, because I think that's overplayed, but I don't think we look at the psychology behind that. We just use it in such a passing manner that we champion creative individuals as these stock and vigilant rebels, but not realizing that there is certainly a biological factor, I feel, in low latent inhibition, that they have somewhat of a disposition to be the way that they are. But then there's two, that there are behavioral and cultural factors that weigh into them being highly creative, because they're not socialized to the same extent that other people are. And I think what I said previously makes it clear in what I mean by that. You know, if you sit a kid at a table and they don't like green beans, but their parents sit there and say, no, you're going to eat your green beans whether you like it or not, and they get inundated in that sort of thinking that they must accept what's presented to them, whether they're with it or not with it, I think just the creative individual refuses to just swallow that and accept that. So it's this quality of being rebellious, it's this quality of being unsocial in the right way that allows somebody to be creative, and allows them to pay attention to things in the environment that just other people wouldn't pay attention to. It's like you can look at some inventions like the Post-it note and think, well, why didn't other people come up with that? Because other people just didn't think it was necessary. Because why do you want that thing, and why does it have a necessity? And the person who comes up with the Post-it note says that, hey, we have a need here. It's a small need, but it's a need nonetheless, and you can't say that any need is less significant than the other. So I'm going to come up with this thing, and we'll see what happens with it. And there we go. We have a Post-it note. I think most things are like that. Einstein, even large acts of creativity, there's something wrong with Jupiter's orbit, and Newtonian mechanics aren't just predicting some phenomena that we're observing with our experimentation with light and electromagnetism. well, what the hell's going on? Like, what does that mean? And most physicists just buried their head in the sand. It's not, I don't think they couldn't have answered the question, but it's just that the small things are the things we think are insignificant. Kids usually notice them, and people with low latent inhibition, adults with low latent inhibition, notice them. So I think that that's what constitutes rebellion, just not accepting what is given and things that are incomplete, wanting to make them complete, or just wanting to understand more. And then I say that, so I don't want to really discern between what some researchers call big C and little c creativity. I just want to say creativity in general, and I want to sit there and I want to sit here and say that there's this being childlike, it's the base is in a sense for creativity, because children, they're rebellious and they're non socialized. But also one thing that's very interesting, and I wish I could remember the name of the study, but you give children, this is surprising, you give children a puzzle. And children, because they don't know anything, they're essentially naive, they're just exploring the world. You give them a puzzle that's unsolvable, and they don't know that it's unsolvable, they keep trying to solve it, period. Until you tell them that they can't, or they get emotionally too frustrated and they cry and they give up. But it's nobody, they don't, one, look at that thing and think, oh, unsolved problem, and two, well, it's because they don't know any better, and two, they're so vigilant and vigorous at trying to solve it because they have this belief that they can solve it, which is so interesting, because I think the same thing is in a highly creative individual. There's a sufficient condition for hope in creativity. It's like it's a sufficient condition, and so much so that it guarantees that creativity is something that can be, well, at least that the problem can be solved through insistence and sustained effort. And I think that that can just be described or defined as hope, that creative individuals, they're hopeful, but they're just this combination between being rebellious and hopeful, and it's this combination of rebellion and hopefulness that constitutes the trait of being childlike, at least so far as I understand it. And these things, I don't know how far they can be used in a research setting to sit there and say, hey, let's search for this when we investigate creativity. But I think it's something that you can observe in most creative individuals. They're rebellious, and at the same time, they're hopeful. And I think that that's what it means to be childlike. And I think that for anybody who is even concerned with creativity, or even increasing their own creativity, just look at the problems around you, and what have you sat there and accepted that's incomplete, that you just don't really think is sufficient, and work on fixing that thing. And maybe you don't, maybe there is a solution, maybe there's not a solution, you don't know, but don't let that ignorance discourage you from having a hopefulness and arriving at some sort of conclusion. Either it has an answer or it doesn't have an answer, and you can come to that conclusion. So I think that that, in a practical sense, is what it means to be childlike for every individual, and the neurological sense that low latent inhibition has a lot to say with the characteristic of being childlike and highly creative individuals. And that is my message. Thank you.